The day I found out my grandmother had left me $28 million was the same day my parents told me it didn't really belong to me. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that moment split my life cleanly into a before and an after. I remember sitting at my tiny kitchen table, staring at my phone, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it, while my mom's voice came through the speaker, tight and controlled, saying, "We need to talk about the money. Your grandmother intended that for the whole family." And I want to ask you right now, before I even explain how any of this happened, was I wrong for thinking that what she legally and clearly left to me was actually mine? I know how that sounds. I know how people react when they hear a number like $28 million. It feels unreal, like something out of a movie or a clickbait headline. But this is my life, and what made it even more surreal was that until that phone call, I was just normal, not rich, not struggling in a dramatic way, just a regular person who had lost their grandmother. The one person in my family who had always seen me and was still trying to breathe through the grief when suddenly everyone else decided I was the villain in a story I didn't even know I was in yet. So tell me, honestly, if you were in my place, what would you have done? To understand why this hurt so much, you have to understand my family dynamic, and especially my relationship with my grandmother. I'll call her Nana, because that's what I always called her. Even when I was an adult and she'd laugh and say I was too old for that, Nana wasn't always rich. That's one of the biggest misconceptions my parents loved to gloss over later. She married my grandfather young, they worked hard, and for decades they were solidly middle class. My grandfather ran a small manufacturing business that slowly, painfully grew over time. Nana handled the books, negotiated contracts, and did a lot of the invisible labor that no one ever credited her for. When my grandfather passed away unexpectedly, Nana didn't sell the business like everyone assumed she would. She doubled down. She learned everything. She expanded. She invested. Over the next 20 years, that company exploded in value, and she diversified into real estate and stocks. By the time she was in her late 70s, she was worth more money than anyone in our family had ever imagined. My parents, especially my dad, loved to talk about how lucky Nana was. That word always bothered me. They'd say it at holidays, with a kind of joking bitterness, like, "Well, Nana just got lucky with the market," or, "Must be nice to have money working for you." What they didn't say was how often Nana had bailed them out. Growing up, I saw it over and over again. When my parents bought a house they couldn't afford, Nana helped with the down payment. When my dad's business idea failed, Nana quietly paid off the debt so we wouldn't lose everything. When my parents wanted to send my older brother to an expensive private college, Nana wrote the checks. She never made a big show of it. She never demanded anything in return. But she also never forgot. I was the youngest child, the afterthought in a lot of ways. My brother was the golden one. He did everything right in my parents' eyes. Good grades, good school, good job. I was the creative one, which in my family was just a polite way of saying, unreliable. I bounced between majors in college. I worked jobs my parents didn't understand. They loved me, I think, but there was always this undercurrent of disappointment. Nana, on the other hand, never made me feel like I was too much or not enough. When I was a kid, I'd spend entire summers at her house. She'd let me sit in her home office, coloring or reading while she worked. She talked to me like I mattered. She explained things. She told me stories about her mistakes, her regrets, her fears. She didn't sugarcoat life, but she also never told me to shrink myself to fit someone else's expectations. As she got older, I became her default helper. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted to. I drove her to appointments. I helped her organize paperwork. I listened when she talked about how lonely she felt after my grandfather died. My parents and my brother were busy with their own lives, and they'd call her, sure, but I was the one who showed up. We got closer in those years than I ever was with anyone else in my family. She trusted me. I didn't realize how much until much later. When Nana's health started to decline for real, things changed. Doctor's visits turned into hospital stays. Hospital stays turned into hospice care. That period is still a blur of antiseptic smells, whispered conversations, and the constant, low-level dread that comes with knowing you're about to lose someone you love. My parents suddenly became very present. They visited more. They talked about the family a lot. They asked Nana questions about her will, framed as concern. "Have you gotten everything sorted?" My mom would say, smiling too brightly. Nana would look at me when those questions came up, and there was something in her eyes I didn't understand at the time. One afternoon, when it was just the two of us, Nana asked me to sit down. Her voice was weak, but her mind was sharp. She told me she had updated her estate plan. She said she wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I remember laughing nervously and telling her she didn't need to worry about me, that I'd be fine. She squeezed my hand with surprising strength and said, "I know you will be. That's not the point." She didn't give details. She didn't tell me numbers. She just said she loved me and that she was proud of me. I cried like a child in that moment, because some part of me already knew. When Nana passed away, it broke me. I won't pretend otherwise. The funeral was a strange mix of genuine grief and performative sadness. People came out of the woodwork. Distant relatives I hadn't seen in years hugged me and talked about what an amazing woman she was. My parents held it together in public, but behind closed doors, they were tense, whispering, making phone calls. I was numb. I just wanted my grandmother back. A few weeks later, I got a call from Nana's lawyer. He asked me to come in to discuss the will. I assumed this was standard procedure, that everyone would be there together. When I asked if my parents would be present, he paused and said, "No, this meeting is specifically for you." My stomach dropped. I remember driving to his office in a haze, convinced there had been some mistake. Sitting in that office, with its leather chairs and diplomas on the wall, I listened as he explained Nana's estate. He talked about trusts, assets, properties, investments. The numbers didn't register at first. When he finally said the total value of what Nana had left to me, I actually laughed out loud, because it sounded absurd. $28 million. Not shared, not divided. Left to me, I felt dizzy, I felt guilty, I felt overwhelmed. I felt like I didn't deserve it, and also like Nana had known exactly what she was doing. The lawyer showed me the documents. Everything was clear. Everything was legal. Nana had left smaller amounts to other family members, including my parents and my brother, but the bulk of her estate was mine. She'd written a letter, too, addressed to me. I won't share all of it, but one line is burned into my memory. "I am leaving you this not because you need it, but because I trust you." I walked out of that office in shock, clutching copies of paperwork that would change my life forever. I didn't tell anyone right away. I needed time to process. I needed to grieve. But secrets like that don't stay secret for long. My parents found out within days. I don't know who told them, but suddenly my phone was ringing nonstop. That's when the call I mentioned at the beginning happened. My mom's voice, my dad chiming in, both of them insisting that Nana would never have wanted this. That she must have been confused. That I was being selfish for even thinking of keeping it. They said it wasn't about them. It was about fairness. About family. They said the money should be pooled and distributed equally. They said I was too young, too irresponsible, too emotional to handle that kind of wealth. They brought up every mistake I'd ever made, every insecurity they knew I had. My brother texted me separately, saying he was disappointed in me for not immediately offering to share. The grief I was already carrying turned into something heavier, darker. I tried to explain that I hadn't done anything. I hadn't manipulated Nana. I hadn't asked for this. This was her decision. That didn't matter to them. In their eyes, I had something they wanted, and that changed everything. Family dinners turned into interrogations. Every conversation circled back to the money. I started to dread my phone lighting up with their names. And this is where I want to pause for a second and talk directly to you. Up to this point, all I had done was exist, love my grandmother. and inherit what she chose to leave me. I was standing at the edge of a decision that would define my relationships for the rest of my life. So before I tell you what I did next, before I explain how things escalated from tense phone calls to something much worse, I want you to put yourself in my place. If your family told you that something legally and intentionally left to you didn't belong to you, what would you have done? Would you have given in to keep the peace, or would you have stood your ground? Because after that moment, after those conversations, nothing was the same. The pressure intensified. My parents started showing up unannounced. They brought spreadsheets. They brought plans. They talked about how the money could help everyone, how it could secure futures, pay off debts, create opportunities. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, generous, even. But underneath it all was the unspoken assumption that my role was to hand it over, quietly and gratefully, and be thankful for whatever scraps they decided I deserved. I started to see patterns I'd ignored my whole life. The way my needs were always secondary. The way my boundaries were treated as suggestions. Nana had seen it, too. That realization hurt almost as much as losing her. I spent nights staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, rereading Nana's letter, trying to figure out how honoring her wishes had turned me into the family villain. By the time I realized my parents were willing to go further than emotional manipulation, that they were willing to challenge the will itself, it was already too late to pretend this would blow over. That's where this part of the story has to pause, because what came next forced me to make a choice I never thought I'd have to make, one that would burn bridges I didn't know could be burned, and change my understanding of family forever. When I say things escalated, I don't mean in a dramatic, movie-style way all at once. It was slower, more insidious, like watching a crack spread across glass. At first, it was just more phone calls, more messages, more concern. My parents framed everything as love. They kept saying they were just trying to protect me, to protect the family, to honor Nana's true intentions. That phrase became their favorite weapon. Every time I brought up the will, the lawyer, the letter Nana had written me, they'd brush it off and say, "You know what she really meant." And every time they said that, it felt like they were erasing her voice all over again. The first time my dad suggested challenging the will outright, it was almost casual. We were sitting in their living room, the same room where I'd grown up, surrounded by old family photos that suddenly felt like props in a play I didn't want to be in. He said, "We've talked to someone who says there might be grounds to contest it. Just in case." I remember my heart pounding in my ears. I asked him what he meant by grounds, and he shrugged, saying things like Nana's age, her health, the possibility of undue influence. I felt sick. The implication was clear. They were willing to paint me as a manipulator, someone who had taken advantage of a dying woman. I stood up and told them that was crossing a line. My mom started crying immediately, saying I was attacking them, that after everything they'd done for me, this was how I repaid them. My brother sat there silently, arms crossed, avoiding my eyes. I left shaking, my hands numb on the steering wheel as I drove home, realizing that the family I thought I had was slipping away. That night, I called Nana's lawyer again. I told him everything. He was calm, professional, and reassuring, but he didn't sugarcoat things. He said that while the will was solid, anyone could file a challenge. It would be stressful. It would be expensive. It would get ugly. I asked him what Nana would have wanted me to do. He paused and said, "Based on everything she told me, she wanted you to stand firm." Hearing that made me cry harder than I had since the funeral. So I hired my own attorney. Signing that retainer agreement felt like crossing a point of no return. Part of me hoped that just the act of taking it seriously would make my parents back off. Instead, it poured gasoline on the fire. When they found out, they accused me of lawyering up against my own family. My dad sent me a long email listing everything they'd ever done for me, every sacrifice, every dollar spent raising me, as if parenting was some kind of loan I was now expected to repay with interest. They officially filed to contest the will a few weeks later. Seeing my parents' names on legal documents opposing me was surreal. Friends asked why I looked exhausted all the time. I stopped sleeping. I replayed my childhood in my head, searching for signs I'd missed. Moments when love had been conditional and I'd just been too young to notice. The stress started to seep into every part of my life. I couldn't focus. I snapped at people who didn't deserve it. I felt isolated in a way I never had before. The discovery process was brutal. My parents' lawyers requested medical records, personal emails, text messages. They wanted to prove Nana wasn't of sound mind or that I'd influenced her. Reading their claims felt like being slapped over and over again. They painted Nana as fragile and confused, and me as some scheming beneficiary lurking in the background. It was insulting to both of us. I kept thinking about how Nana would have reacted if she'd seen this. The thought made my chest ache. In the middle of all this, my brother finally reached out in person. He asked to meet for coffee. I went, foolishly hopeful that maybe he wanted to make peace. Instead, he told me I was tearing the family apart. He said Mom and Dad were miserable, that this was killing them. He said that if I just agreed to split the money evenly, everything could go back to normal. I asked him why normal required me to give up something Nana had intentionally given me. He didn't have an answer. He just said, because that's what family does. That sentence haunted me. What does family do, really? Does family respect your boundaries? Does it honor the wishes of the dead? Or does it pressure you until you break, then call it unity? I went home after that meeting and reread Nana's letter for the 100th time. I realized something I hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't just about money. It was about autonomy. About whether I was allowed to make my own decisions, even when they didn't align with what my parents wanted. The court date loomed closer. Mediation was suggested, then attempted. Sitting in a room with a mediator, while my parents argued that the money belonged to everyone, was one of the most emotionally draining experiences of my life. They spoke over me. They cried. They made offers that sounded generous on paper, but came with strings attached, like oversight, conditions, expectations. They wanted control, not compromise. I declined every offer. And then came the moment I'd been both dreading and bracing myself for the hearing. Walking into that courtroom, I felt small. I felt exposed. My parents sat across from me, not looking at me. My lawyer squeezed my arm reassuringly. Nana's will was presented. The medical evaluations were reviewed. Testimony was given. The judge listened patiently. When it was over, I felt hollow. Like all my energy had been drained out of me. The decision came a few weeks later. The judge upheld the will in full. Nana had been of sound mind. There was no evidence of undue influence. The estate was mine, legally, definitively, unquestionably. When my lawyer called me with the news, I sat on the floor and sobbed, not just from relief, but from grief all over again. Winning didn't feel triumphant. It felt like surviving something I never asked to endure. My parents' reaction was swift and devastating. They accused me of choosing money over family. They told extended relatives their version of the story, leaving out inconvenient facts. Some people believed them. Others stayed silent. Invitations stopped coming. Holidays became empty. My brother cut off contact completely. The family I'd grown up in effectively disintegrated. In the aftermath, I had to figure out how to live with what I'd inherited. I set up trusts. I hired financial advisors. I donated to causes Nana cared about. I paid off my own debts quietly. I tried to be responsible, thoughtful, intentional. But none of that filled the emotional void. There were nights I lay awake wondering if it had been worth it, if I should have just given them what they wanted and kept the illusion of family intact. But then I'd remember the way they'd treated Nana's wishes as optional. The way they'd been willing to destroy my character to get what they wanted. And I'd remember that Nana had trusted me, not them, with the legacy she built with her own hands. Slowly, painfully, I started to understand that honoring her meant accepting the cost. Time passed. The anger cooled into something quieter, sadder. I built a new support system. Friends who knew the whole story and stood by me. Therapy helped more than I can say. I learned that boundaries aren't betrayals, even when people accuse you of making them so. I learned that money doesn't change people as much as it reveals them. I still miss my family. I miss the idea of them, at least. I miss who I thought they were, but I don't regret my choice. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about greed. It was about respecting a woman who loved me and made a deliberate decision. It was about finally standing up for myself in a family where I'd always been expected to bend. So that's how it ended. I inherited $28 million, and I lost my parents and my brother in the process. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do it differently if I could go back. The honest answer is no. Because if I'd given in, I wouldn't have just lost the money, I would have lost myself. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. I know it's messy, complicated, and uncomfortable. Life usually is. If you were on my side, if you think I did the right thing, go ahead and like this video. Subscribe for more stories like this, because there are so many people out there dealing with impossible family situations they never talk about. And please, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. I really want to know what you would have done in my place. I'll see you all in the next story.